Welcome to EAPN Talk. I'm Kahina. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the European Office of the European Anti-Poverty Network. So the EAPN Talk, for those who don't know, it's a regular webinar that the Brussels office is organizing to dive into some political topics that in our regular work from day to day, we don't have either the priorities or the capacity to explore. And for the rest of the year, for 2025, we decided with the colleagues to dive into the topics of the economy and the politics of poverty, the role and the function that poverty operates in liberal economy and society, how and why the eradication of poverty that we are aiming for, it must come with strong challenges of the status quo and the power dynamics, if not the abolition of the current economy that we know, what poverty and its different manifestations says about our society, and of course how mobilization have in history and in the current struggle have shaped the resistance against poverty and exclusion. And today we welcome Professor Daniel Zamora. Your work is at the crossroad between different social science with sociology, economics, and history. You do the analysis of how the evolution of liberalism and capitalism and its forces have shaped and changed the very principles of welfare state. You're also very much known for your critiques of the universal basic income, and you have conducted several studies in that way to showcase how, in appearance, a so-called revolutionary policy will, on the contrary, reinforce a market-based view of welfare and social protection. And so as an anti-poverty network, we try to influence how and shape current policy proposal. However, with this talk, with this webinar, we want to take a step back to develop our vision for systemic change that really eradicates poverty in Europe and beyond. Before I leave you to your presentation, I just want to remind people that the webinar is recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, we ask you to keep your camera off. And if you don't mind being recorded, we ask you kindly to put your camera on, as you have been in many online webinars and meetings since at least 5 years, if not more. You all know the difference between that it makes to actually see people online. But again, thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us. And for your preliminary introduction, we would like you to start by explaining how, and according to your research, how the vision of poverty and also the fight against poverty has changed over the last century.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the very broad question. Although in 20 minutes I'm going to do something that is going to be very simplistic, so kind of try to draw a kind of a history of the way we conceptualize poverty and how it has changed over the 20th century. And I'm going to start actually in the 19th century, so it's even a bigger picture in a certain sense. But I think it's always useful to take a step back and to think about the categories we use, the way we think about poverty, the tools we use, where they come from, and what kind of a image or representation it actually produce. And because of course the way we think about it is also, it's already a way also to think about solutions. So it's the way we conceptualize something is generally also offers a certain perspective, or trying to produce a certain set of solutions. So this is basically something I've been working on for some time now, but it's going to be, again, very simplistic. So forgive me if I go very fast on the history. But the first question I would have asked is, of course, what is poverty? And this is it seems kind of a very stupid, at the same time broad question. But of course, over the last 2 centuries, the definition has changed. The word has changed. In French, for example, the word pauvreté wasn't that common in the 19th century. It was more like paupérisme. It was also referred to the social question. And so basically the problem we generally refer when we think about poverty is the problem of the 19th century, or what was called the social question. But today, if you ask in the street to anyone what does it mean to be poor, it's generally a lack of money. And so this definition, of course, is like now dominant. Being poor is not having enough money. And it is quite late, actually, that we thought about poverty in those terms. I mean, the very idea of a line of poverty, so a line of income under which you can be considered as poor, actually emerged really in the late 19th century by this social reformer called Charles Booth that made these maps of poverty in London and had began to actually define a certain set of categories, a certain set of level of income, which from the start was kind of a relative, of course, because then the level of resources you need to sustain yourself, to reproduce yourself, depends from one society to another, to the social standards, to a certain norms that differ from one context to another. But this is really late 19th century that it begins to happen. And the story, I mean, goes pretty fast to the mid 20th century in Europe. And here I'm just going to put like a landmark book by Peter Townsend that actually define more precisely this idea of poverty as a relative notion. So now it's by the 80s in Europe, we have now these notions of 50% of 60% of the median wage. So those are the definitions that we are generally the most common in Europe today. But as you see, they become really mainstream quite late. So it's only from the 80s that we began to use those categories, that began to measure poverty in those terms. And what I'd like to do now in the 20 minutes that I have is to actually try to see how we came to think poverty in those terms and what are the transformations that were necessary to actually even conceptualize poverty in income terms, and also in a way that requires to compare people one to another, to actually classify them one aside as a collection of individuals and look how income is distributed in society. So there are three transformations, and here this again is like very ambitious, and maybe we can expand when we're going to discuss it later. But that makes this definition impossible before the 18th and 19th century. I mean, the first one is, of course, the end of Ancien Régime. It's the French Revolution, and the idea that we can compare individuals, that somehow they are equal in a formal sense. This is like a very important transformation, because, of course, if you are in Ancien Régime society, the idea of comparing yourself to the Lord doesn't make any sense. I mean, you can compare yourself, but the difference between you and the Lord, or between a master and a slave, is a qualitative difference. It's not a quantitative difference. So in France, for a long time, there was a very famous book by Marc Bloch, the French historian, about the powers of the king. So the king has actually divine attributes. He can actually heal people by touching them. So of course, it doesn't make any sense for a peasant to think that the king or the lord the castle is too big compared to himself, because the nature between them is radically different. While today, of course, if you work at Amazon and then you think Jeff Bezos has too much money, it does make sense to actually think that there is some kind of an injustice here. But it requires the formal equality of individuals to actually even envision to measure people on a scale where you can put all them together. So that's a very important, of course, transformation. Is like this formal equality that make the difference between individuals a quantitative difference and not a qualitative difference. So that's the first aspect, of course. And then, of course, before that, the idea of having data, I mean, it didn't exist, but collecting data and comparing them is not even something one can envision politically in a certain sense. The second aspect, which is of course extremely important and that shapes the social question in a modern sense, is the new status of property in, of course, an emerging new economic system that is capitalism. Of course, before that, already in the 18th century, the question of property was the center of one of the most important books on the question of poverty and inequality, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau discourse on the origins of inequality. And of course, the introduction of property is already something that he discussed in the book. But of course, by the 19th century, it takes a really completely radically new turn, because with the development of capitalism, with the development of large units of production, you can't be just a small owner anymore. You can't just have, like in this image, this kind of old system where everybody has some means of production in the house. The family is an economic unit, and you can somehow live in this, function in this economy by having little tools of production. Now, the large unit of productions creates a new class that doesn't have any means of production anymore, and have to sell their work, their labor, on a labor market that becomes to exist by the early 19th century. And so this is, of course, what Karl Polanyi has wrote about with the demise of the Spinelland system, the transformation of the poor law. And so you have all these labor market, and of course, this is the outcome of that is that labor becomes a commodity. So this new status of property, which implies that you can't be in a democracy of small owners anymore. So there is a question about the status of those who don't own anything that becomes a central question. In the social question is about also the status of those who haven't any kind of ownership. And this is something that is quite central in the discussions in the middle of the 19th century. One example that I like to use and that I generally read to my students is Tocqueville's discourse at the French National Assembly a week before the revolutions of 1848. And of course, Tocqueville is not a socialist, he's not a radical, but he immediately sees that the transformations through which France is going, and basically also the Industrial Revolution, because before going to America, he goes to Manchester, he observes the effects of the Industrial Revolution. He's obviously very shocked by the level of inequality, and especially the importance that property takes in this context. I'm going to read what he says in the Assembly a few days before the revolutions. He says, "Before long, the political struggle will be restricted to those who have and those who have not. Property will form the great field of battle. Can you not see that their passions, instead of political, have become social?" And this is kind of an important sentence, but of course, what he's saying is that this new transformation of property, when he says passions are become social, is like the passions now have the object of those passions are the society itself, not who governs us, not just which economics political system. It's the society itself that is at stake. So that's the idea of the social question. It's like this, but the question arises and question the whole social order and the way it's organized. And so this is, of course, a crucial aspect of what would be called in France la question sociale. And the third one, which is obviously quite logically the question of work, is that now if you have this whole class of persons that doesn't have access to property and doesn't have any other way to reproduce themselves, to actually get the means to pay for their food, to pay for their clothes. The only mean they have is to sell the labor on a labor market. Then the status of work becomes extremely important. And one of the also early studies on the origins of misery, de la misère, or du paupérisme in French, which was done by this journalist, economist in France in 1840, which is called Eugène Buret, who wrote this book that compares or that tries to understand the causes of poverty in 19th century in France and England. Immediately the book, and it's going to be quite an influential book. Now it's quite forgotten, but Marx will be, of course, quite influenced by it. Many socialists will be very influenced by this and will actually take most of the arguments that are in the book, not always quoting the original, but the Buret's book is quite fascinating. And what he immediately points out as a cause of this social question is what he calls the cruel and despairing theory of labor as a commodity. The idea that labor is just a commodity that is as any other commodity that has to be sold in the market, and there is an offer and a demand, and so the price of labor is regulated by the market mechanism. And that's for him the center of the social question. It's related to the status of work. If one persists in living labor under the law of commodities, capital will necessarily become for him not a buyer, but the hardest of the masters. And so immediately you see that these two questions that are, it seems to me, the central questions relating to the question of poverty in the 19th century induce a certain set of responses. I mean, the most obvious one is that if labor is the only way for a whole class of citizens to actually access the means to reproduce themselves, then maybe labor has either to be regulated, not as a commodity, so it's the beginning of the labor law, or has to become a right. So that was, of course, the claim of this French socialist called Louis Blanc, which was very influential in the middle of the 19th century, and that actually asks for this idea to transform work into a right, so un droit au travail, which today, I mean, there are some debates today that actually are reminiscent to that, the idea of a job guarantee, for example, this whole question of making, if to provide for yourself and your family, you need to work, then it shouldn't be something that is up to the market, but it has to be guaranteed as a right. So I'm just going to stop here for this 19th century, but it offers, in my view, a kind of an interesting way to interpret how the welfare state or the institutions of the 20th century will be oriented toward two things. One, which is transforming the status of property in society. So for those who don't have access to property, then we can create what we call a social property. So this is the term that was invented also in France in the 19th century by a French thinker, what he would call the propriété sociale. So for those who don't have access to property, there's going to be a public property for all those. So they're going to be owners, but in a more less individualized way, in a more social way, right? So which means social security, of course, public services in a certain sense. There's a big difference between public service, social security, assistance systems. But for now, I'm not go into the details of all those distinctions, but this idea that your market dependency is reduced by the fact that you have access to a certain set of services and rights independently of whether or not you have money, right? Then the second aspect, the question of the status of work, will be, of course, the slow development of labor law and collective bargaining. The idea that the question here is obviously power relations between two terms, between capital and labor. And so if we want to address the social question, we need to offer this form of social property and transform radically the status of work, and especially decommodify work in a certain sense and allow a different terms in the power balance between power and capital and labor. I would add a third aspect that is quite important to me, which is, and I would just quote, of course, one of the founders of the British welfare state, which is William Beveridge. And if you read the report that he actually wrote during the war, I mean, he wrote two reports, and then the second one, Full Employment in a Free Society, I think is 1944. And it's a very, very, very interesting document because it's obvious that for most of these thinkers, the idea of addressing the social question through cash, basically altering the income distribution, is not at all something they considered. It seemed like not exactly a proper way to actually balance those power relations, to transform the economies in which they thought produced poverty. And the justification he gives in the book, I mean, he goes several times about the question of altering income distribution, but he says something that I find quite interesting. He says, there are vital things needing to be done to raise the standard of health and happiness in Britain, which can only be done by common action, which in a community where democracy is so well established as in Britain will be secure in accord with the wishes of the citizen by a democratically controlled state. What he's basically saying is that there are two ways to orient social aims in society. One way is, of course, the market. The market allocates investments and produce a certain set of needs. The other is democracy. We discuss together. We can debate about whether or not we want to invest in schools or in healthcare or in free kindergarten. I mean, we can debate about all this, but collectively. So, and it would create a different set of needs. So behind his argument, there is really this question that I would say, that's what I would argue, this kind of a third aspect, that we need to democratize social aims. The idea is like, what as a society we want, what do we want as a society? What kind of needs we want to develop, what kind of a model of citizenship, because what is central in Beveridge's argument is also a certain kind of citizenship where citizens are actively deliberating about the kind of society they want shape. So it's displacing the way we think about needs outside also, let's say, a strictly market mechanism that privatize social ends to private actors that obviously, invest in things that they bet that will be bought. They might not be bought, but overall, the whole trajectory society takes is fully to totally privatized in that sense. So I would say those are three things that are crucial in my view that come out from the debates, most of the debates, or that are at the center of the debates during the 19th century about the social question. The question of property, the status of property, the question of the state of work and labor, and how we shape our needs, how we define our needs, and different mechanisms, the institution setting to develop and decide about what kind of needs we can develop. So we come now to our view. So how did we shift it to a more individualized income-based view? So as I said, the very idea of a poverty line came pretty late, so late 19th century, and only became kind of mainstream by the 80s. And the first person to actually collect data in income distribution, which requires to actually see society as a collection of individuals. I mean, no economist in the 19th century thought about that. They thought about factors of productions, the part of income that goes to capital and labor. It didn't make sense to them to just organize data as if you just have atomized individuals in society. But the first to do it, so it requires a more individualistic understanding of society, is this Italian economist called Vilfredo Pareto, who politically was a bit of on the extreme right, to be honest. It has nothing to do with his work, but he's the first one to actually beginning to collect data on what we call interpersonal inequality. So just looking about how income is distributed again among individuals, and that requires, in a certain sense, a certain acceptation of the market as a central institution to allocate goods in society. And a few decades later, in the 30s, this is of course one that is probably more famous, but it's he's quite interesting to look at when we think about poverty, which is Milton Friedman. And I do a very rapid shift here from Pareto to Friedman, which is a bit could be seen as a bit polemic, but he immediately has this. He sees the problem in capitalism. He sees that there is something that it generates huge inequalities and that it requires state intervention. He is actually active in the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration, but he's quite hostile to the idea that we should actually deal with this problem by limiting the effects of the market or by actually protecting people from the market itself. And so the argument he comes with is this idea that we should actually accept how the market mechanism generates inequalities. And if there are too big inequalities, if the effects of these inequalities are too intense, then we can actually address those by cash transfers, by altering the fiscal system and use the fiscal apparatus to actually transform the income distribution in society rather than guarantee social rights outside of the market. So quite early on, he's kind of obsessed by this question. He actually has a lot of debates about how we should determine what he called a minimum standard of living. It's kind of a huge debate in the interwar period about calorie counts, about all the things to actually try to set objectively a threshold of income that could function as a kind of an objective line of poverty. But quite early on, his response would be that we should definitely not try to substitute the choices of people. People should be free to make the choices they want on the market. If they want to buy bread or if they want to go to the dentist rather than going on holidays, that's their problem. And so the only way to address poverty is to guarantee a certain level of income. And that's what he and economists in this interwar period would call what they say the welfare state, the welfare without the welfare state. Meaning we need to guarantee a certain level of welfare, but without all this set of complex institutions that actually are detrimental to the market, to the dynamism in the market. His view of course will not be dominant at all when he's like writing these things in the 30s and 40s. But by the 70s, of course, a certain set of questions about the Keynesian solutions began to be regarded more critically. I mean, there are obviously movements that promote way more liberalization and deregulation of the economic sphere. And the space opens up, in a certain sense, for a different kind of anti-poverty policy, one that is more focused on this idea of a threshold of a poverty line and less around the transforming radically society, and especially in how the whole society relates to the market, not just those who are in need, if I could say so. And it shapes, this is my argument, I don't know where I'm in time, maybe I'm still okay, yeah. What I would, what was termed by an English economist, what he called redistributive market liberalism. Again, I'm trying to, paint here a kind of a big story. Depending on the country, these shifts are more or less important, and it's way more complex than that. It's not like we are fully in this model in Belgium, for example, or in many countries in Europe, but it's kind of a shift that is present in all those countries at different degrees, right? And the idea is that now the state should, disinvest this providing a certain set of services, like having like public companies in energy, providing a certain set of rights in form of services, and rather guarantee only a certain level of income. So you have like this retreat from the state as a collective decision maker that actually actively orient investment in a certain sense. I mean, to a certain degree, where a state what only guarantees that the competition between individuals is, I'm not going to say fair, but at least that everyone can take part in the competition of the market, right? So that's kind of shapes two very different views about how you can guarantee that individuals are able to meet their needs, if I can put it in those terms. So the state must have a dominant role in matters of income distribution, but should discharge this responsibility with as little interference as possible in the workings of the free market. And this comes by the 90s with a whole set of literature, which is quite influential, especially in development economics. So the whole retreat of the idea that the policy of that poverty is tied to a certain notion of development, and that the mission of the state is industrialization, which was the aim of most of the leaders of the decolonizations in the 50s and 60s, and the idea that now cash is like the most efficient way to meet people's need. I mean, you have, of course, Just Give Money to the Poor, which was a very influential book in development communities in the recent decades. And I would finish like on this, not to speak too long and to give some space to the discussion, I guess, that it shapes, two visions over the last 2 centuries, 2 visions of the social question, but also two visions of citizenship in a certain sense. One whose aim is to change social relations and power relations in society, through one that is more focused on changing income distribution, meaning your position, your individual position in the income distribution. One that is, focused on power relations in general. One that is transforming the income distribution. One that is reducing market dependency. The other is allowing everyone to be part of the market. So those who actually don't have enough spending power to have enough to actually be able to buy on the market what they need. And in the end, one that is about politicizing human needs, making human needs a political question, right? So it's also about thinking about the kind of society that we want. And the other is about allowing everyone to be a sovereign consumer, and so allowing to choose for himself. But it depicts 2 very radically different visions of what's the aim of social policy, and 2 radically different visions of also what does it mean to be a citizen. I would just maybe make a last little graph. I have a few, but maybe I'll use them later. Of course, if we take, the most extreme case of this shift, is the US. It's not the same in most countries. Of course, Europe hasn't uh, gone through the same transformation. But if you look at about the ratio between in-kind transfers are, let's say, transfers that are given in the form of services, right? And cash transfers. So if you look about the period from the 70s to nowadays, I mean, the spike there is obviously the COVID cash. So there was like a moment where cash transfer became extremely appealing in the context of the pandemic. But if you look at the trend, it's pretty obvious that over the last 50 years, public spending has been, especially in the question of social policy, has been more and more in providing cash to individuals and less, or at least hasn't really changed this question of providing more services. So it's a retreat of a state as an actor that will actively shape the kind of the rights we have access to one what can guarantee or spending power, if you will. I think I'm definitely over 20 minutes now, so I'm not sure, but I think it's good to actually anyway leave open the floor to question, as the discussion is pretty large at this point.
Thank you very much. And it really was not a problem having you go over the 20 minutes for any of us. It was very interesting and also kind of self-reflecting as a network where we have been advocating for more support, especially in times of crisis with the energy voucher and stuff like that, where we also reflect a lot about our own policy. And I think your presentation about the evolution of what is poverty and what should be the role of the social protection system in general, whether we're talking about employment benefit, pension, or cash benefits, or whatever. Where is the line between reinforcing something that is systemically failing those who are living in poverty, but when you look at the long term, but in the short term, you need to pay your rent, you need people to be able to pay their bills, while at the same time, how do we advocate for something that is more transformative, to reuse the word that you used, and also where can we be strategic, I think, in a way in our day-to-day work in the network. Before we leave the floor to the question, we prepare some reflection that we wanted you to also explore. You worked a lot on the welfare, the evolution of the welfare system in Belgium and how it has evolved around over the century. Can you explain a little some more the impact that the economic models, also after the Second World War and the creation of the social security, how it have evolved now to what we know? And how this, of course, this is very typical to Belgium, but maybe it can also resonate to other networks who are joining us from other countries.
Yeah, so that's that's also a broad question. So I can say a few things. I actually had a little slide here. That was a slide. It's a quote from Jan Franken, which is like this kind of a great specialist of poverty in Belgium. He's now retired, but he was a pioneer on the study on the question of poverty especially in Belgium. And I did my PhD on the history of assistance in Belgium, assistance systems in Belgium. And what was of interest to me is like the interaction between the insurance system and the question of unemployment benefits is, of course, now very at the center of many discussions, especially in Belgium, because we had this reform that limits the time of unemployment benefits to 2 years, which might be surprising for people from other countries, that we still had an unlimited time for unemployment benefits. But what we have seen over the last, I would say, 20 years or something like that, is definitely this kind of restriction on the coverage of universal systems. So basically, Germany did that like 20 years ago. This idea of restricting social security, making more strictly selective, more control in the social security system, which is completely the opposite of what was expected by the founders of Social Security after the war. So most of them, if you read the text they wrote, how they thought the model will evolve, the ideas that was like Social Security would cover the whole population, and the assistance system would disappear. So this kind of an old system that was inherited from the Middle Ages, from the Bureau de Bienfaisance, would slowly disappear because it was obviously less universal. It was more arbitrary. I mean, there were a lot of problems with that system, and that at one point everybody would be included in the social security system. And by the 70s, it's the exactly opposite that happened. On one side, we reduce the eligibility access to many benefits in social security, and we modernize assistance system. So in Belgium, it's in 74 and 76 where we create this modernized assistance. But in many countries, in France, they did it also in the 80s. So many countries in Europe go through this kind of debates about poverty and the modernization of an assistance system. But what the story it tells us in a certain sense is like the deregulation of the labor market, the privatization of a certain sectors, in a way goes hand with hand with the expansion of the modernization of the assistance system. I mean, the most obvious version of this is people that now is out of the unemployment benefits and that end up in the assistance system. And so there's just a shift from one institution to another, but it's not just, let's say, a shift that is we just go from one system to another. It's also a radical change of the model itself in a way, I think, because it's a change that it's less about, again, providing rights to the whole population and then being way more selective, because of course it depends on your level of income. I mean, the criteria in the CPS are way more strict. And yet I can have this sentence that I thought was capture a bit quite well what happened over the last 30 years. He says, is the direct policy on poverty not carried out in order to neutralize the negative repercussions of the indirect policy on poverty? Meaning that you have all these reforms that deregulate the labor market, that deregulate maybe the housing market, that restrict access to social security, that make a certain set of transformations that make people more sensible to changes in the market. And to address these effects, then we expand this residual system that would provide a certain level of cash, or a basic level of cash to people. And so it's not an accident also that debates about basic income appear at that period. So it's exactly at that moment that also the discussions about guaranteeing a floor of income, that was also an idea that was largely promoted by Milton Friedman in a different version of it, become to be more central, more prominent. That the idea is there from the late 19th century. People advocate the idea, but they're not a topic that is debated widely in society. It's really in the 70s that you have like bigger discussions about the possibility to guarantee everyone a floor of income. But it does go hand in hand also with the expansion of market in other spheres of social life. So you have on one side the expansion of the market, on the other side the idea that to substitute these older forms of protection, we can expand a different kind of social policy that is more articulate around this definition, that is an income-based definition.
So if I understand correctly your presentation and now your answer, and maybe that could be a segue to my next question, is there is a tension between those who wants to regulate poverty by post-market regulation or post-market policy, which would be the job guarantee, making sure that everyone has a basic level of income, and then they choose, and then you have the expansion of market where everything can be commodified, versus a more traditional, in a sense that it was the premise, the first form of assistance or social security, I would say, where the goal, the stake was to keep out of the market certain needs. to make sure that people, no matter their role and no matter their position in the market, whether they are able to work or not, no matter what, they will have access to certain support or certain level of dignity or a decent level of life. And that it's good that you mentioned the universal basic income. Well, first of all, because that was my next question, but also because I think here it's a good way for us to understand the notion of universal. Because when we talk about universal of rights, we tend to find that it's either everyone is covered, or in at least in our policy field, or we tend to oppose universality of right, of social right, with targeting measures. And with the universal basic income, you have this idea that absolutely everyone should have access to a certain level of income. But that does not really dive into the question of equity and security. It just makes sure that certain people have a level that is deemed appropriate to live, while at the same time the neoliberalism have reappropriated the notion of universal. Maybe you want to dive into that a bit more.
So yeah, I could say a few things. I mean, one thing, again, it's a broad picture, and we would have to go into details about how exactly the welfare state functions, and there's a lot to say. But I think it's good to have also these kind of broad distinctions, right? So I like to contrast two quotes here. So one quote is like from the 30s. It's from this British economist called Richard Downey. So he's like a very close friend to William Beveridge, and he writes one of the first book, whose title is Equality. So it's a whole discussion about what's the meaning of equality, how we should think about equality, and he's like concerned about these questions in the interwar period. And so I'm going to read what he says. Right? He says, "It's not till it's discovered that high individual incomes will not purchase the mass of mankind immunity for cholera, typhus, and ignorance, still less secure them the positive advantage of educational opportunity and economic security, that slowly and reluctantly, amid prophecies of moral degeneration, economic disaster, society begins to make collective provision for needs no ordinary individual, even if he works overtime all his life, can provide for himself." And then 30 years later, you have this friend of Milton Friedman that gives another definition about poverty and all these questions. Is being poor is simply another way of saying one lacks of purchasing power. And so from one to another, I mean, there is obviously this kind of reduction about reducing poverty to an income level. But what is at stake behind this is a debate about human needs. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to go back to this, is like, I think the concern for most of these thinkers, certainly for Beveridge and for a lot of the founders of social security in Europe in the post-war period, was definitely about this question about what is the balance between two modalities of constituting human needs. So I just took this picture of Steve Jobs because I think it's kind of a quite revealing sentence where he says a lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them, meaning that the market is never an institutions that respond to existing preferences. Of course, you choose things you want, but those who decide what you can choose are obviously those who have the capital to do it. So nobody actually had a need for an iPhone. I actually have a need for an iPhone now. Every time I'm addicted to my iPhone. But it's not a need that I decided to develop, of course. So that's the market is an institution that is an institution that constitutes human needs. But then one that escapes the democratic control of society. And the other modality, as I said, is democracy. It's like we discussed together. There is a part of the cake that is socialized, and we discuss what to do with it. And the balance between two modalities of constituting human needs is, I think, at the center of this discussion. And it's kind of telling that in the late 50s, this American economist called John Kenneth Galbraith, this kind of famous Keynesian economist, was very close to Lyndon Johnson when he launches his war on poverty in the early 60s, and he wrote this book called The Affluent Society, and he's thinking about the question of about poverty in America. He's like, we are a very rich society, but at the same time there's still a lot of poverty. And the answer he gave is kind of interesting, because immediately he sees that the question is not just, again, about inequality in a monetary sense. He says the line that divides the area of wealth from the area of poverty is roughly that which divides privately produced and market goods and services from publicly rendered services. In other words, poverty emerged where there was an inadequate balance between the supply of private produced goods and the services and those of the state. So the idea is, again, is like a good policy against poverty is one that actually reshape the balance between two modalities of developing human needs. And that, I think, is kind of central to the 20th century welfare state. It's also an institution that allows us to collectively decide in what society we want to live. But again, it's a very big picture. And you can envision, and this is a kind of important distinction, a society that is strictly egalitarian. So maybe everybody has the exact same amount of money, but one where everything you have to buy it on a market, right? And you can think about society that is also extremely, in a sense of, if you measure the Gini coefficient, they're exactly the same, where people also have the exact amount of wealth, but most things, or a big chunk of those things, are provided through the state or public provision or a certain form of collective services. So these two societies, from the standpoint of measurement, would be exactly the same level of inequality, but there would be radically two different societies. One where, of course, the market decides what we should consume and what we should do with our lives, and the other where we have more control on our own life in a certain sense. But again, it's a very broad distinction. But it is behind, I think, the discussions about basic income lies this question again about what is the part of the wealth we have that can be allocated through a form of democratic control.
Thank you very much. I would like to open the floor to the participant if they want to ask a question or comments, a reflection. I see no comments or question in the chat. It's always the first question, the most difficult one to get, and then people cannot stop, from my experience. Well, I have then a question for you, and maybe that would be a good way to encourage people to take the floor. If the market is seen as the central institution, what's the purpose of fighting poverty then? Then poverty should be seen as natural way to deal with the market residual. Why those who believe so heartedly on the market still believe that they need to be some sort of service après-vente of the market for poverty alleviation? What would be the impact on the market of fighting poverty? Would there be an impact on the market to fight poverty?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. But I mean, one way to put it is like, it's pretty clear that one of the concerns of economists like Friedman or Hayek, I mean, basically the most radical promoters of free market from early on, was that they were extremely conscious that if you just have free market, well, it will self-destruct for different reasons. One is because, of course, just free market led to itself lead to monopolies. So you need the state to actually police the market and allow competition. And on the other side, because huge inequalities will lead to social turmoil and maybe revolution. So you don't want that. So if you want to preserve the market, you have to preserve the market against itself. So you need to actually implement a state that is strongly committed to promoting and to guaranteeing competition. and on the other side, a state that would guarantee a certain level of living, because you have to go back to work the day after. So you need to feed yourself, you need to eat, you need to guarantee a minimum level of income. And that's why, of course, some of them, not all of them, but were quite sympathetic to the idea of a basic income, because that's a kind of policy that is not antithetic with the market mechanism. But then there's another question that you might that your question actually implies, which is it in a certain sense beneficial for growth to struggle against poverty? It's kind of a more instrumental question, I would say. It's like, I don't think that, I'm more committed to redistribution and equality, not because I think it's better for growth, because then if it's not better for growth, then should we do it or not? I mean, that's something, of course, we know that investing in what is called human capital is good for growth in education, in all those things. But at the same time, what I find interesting in these, some of the authors I actually talk about, is like, for them it was also about a certain model of citizenship. And I do think that's something important, that is not just about looking to this question from the lens of efficiency, of economic growth, but also to shaping a certain idea of what does it mean to be part of a political community. What is it? It goes with rights and duties to vote, to pay your taxes, of course, but also perhaps to actively participate in the political sphere, to take part in discussions about what we want as a society. And this is certainly something that was very important for the post-war reformers, because they experienced the war, and during the war, the involvement of citizens in the war effort, what they call the Dunkirk spirit. So seeing people taking boats and going to Dunkirk to actually save soldiers, served as a model of what they expected as a citizenship in the years after that. And so they envision also that those very active citizens could continue to be active to define social aims. So it's not just giving you money, it's about being involved together to actively politicize the aims of society. So this is another, let's say, this another way to think about anti-poverty, but not in the sense just of income, but in the sense of also of enhancing a certain model of democratic life.
We have two questions, Mariama and Evelina. Mariama, do you want to ask your question? Mariama? You muted.
Something is not working on her side.
Okay. So I will move on to the next question. Evelina, do you want to take the... Okay. So I will read her question. It's about the impact of technology on the effect of poverty, considering how quickly the technology develops and how hard it is for labor market, policymakers and union to grasp the impact. Do you think this will deepen the level of poverty and inequality?
Well, that's I'm not a specialist on that question, although there's a big literature, of course, on the what we call, I don't know how we say it in English, what they call the fracture numérique. And of course, that's, yes, the prerequisites to actually enter in the labor market, and to be able to use all these technologies. There is obviously a risk that it will increase a certain inequality in the labor market. But again, that's something that.
But I guess here the question, if I may broaden a bit the spectrum of the question, is the role of the welfare state in making sure that workers or potential workers are fit for the labor market, and who roles is that? Is it the role of the market itself, the companies who need workers to fit into their technology, or is it the role of the society and the welfare state to make sure that they have access to skills? And I think here it's the question of who's responsible for adaptation of the labor market to the technology.
Well, that's, I mean, it would, it would need to go into more specific discussions because, of course, I think in a certain way both. But one thing that I could address, I don't know if it's in the spirit of the question, but one thing that would be very reluctant to fear is whether or not AI will create like mass unemployment. So that's something that comes a lot in discussions lately, of course, in debates about basic income, this idea that somehow these transformations will disrupt labor market and make all these questions about mismatch in skills, which is definitely something that can happen. But what I don't think is that it will actually create unemployment in a certain sense. It's a debate that has been happening since the 60s. So already in the 60s, there were like discussions about that. The point is like there is a lot of jobs that will appear in other parts of the economy, and the key question, which in my view hasn't changed, is about the conditions of those jobs. So all those transformations can create, let's say, Uber Eats, all these kind of new jobs, platform economy, and the point is not that jobs are going to disappear and how we're going to deal with that, deal with the fact that there's going to be just a lack of jobs. The point is like how are we going to regulate these new forms of job, and that's the key question, of course, already today with all these platform economy that will definitely be more see more aggressive transformations in the coming years. But it's a debate about the conditions, about the status of labor, about the regulations in the labor market, rather than a question just on whether they're going to be jobs or not.
Okay, I would have 1,000 follow-up questions on that, but I will give the floor to Lucy Tauber. If you can introduce yourself briefly and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm Lucy Tauber from the Committee of the Regions, European Committee of the Regions, where I'm a policy officer. I work on transport policy and also housing. So thank you very much for the presentation today. It's been very, very interesting for me. I'd like to ask a couple of questions, if I may, on this link to the Social Climate Fund, which, as I see it and in light of what you've said today, is kind of like a modern EU tool for supporting the efforts to address poverty in a specific context, and that is the context of the green transition. What we hear about, as you know, the member states have been required to submit national plans for how they're going to use the Social Climate Fund allocations, and within this context, we're hearing a lot about energy poverty and transport poverty. And with regard to transport, which I worked on more closely, transport poverty is defined in 4 different ways. One of them is traditional sort of income-related poverty, but it's also used to refer to availability of transport services and things like accessibility, in other words, suitability for people with disabilities, people with small children, and so on. And so my first question would be, if I may, how helpful do you think it is, or how suitable in the political dialogue to be mixing the references when we talk about poverty to what we might call traditional poverty, income related, and then these other types of poverty for accessing services, unavailability of services, often that in rural areas. And then perhaps a more political question, how suitable is it in your view as a policy tool, a funding instrument, to have targets which relate to both addressing or supporting people who are experiencing traditional forms of poverty, whether it's transport poverty, energy poverty, housing poverty, and at the same time, other types of measures which are put under the umbrella of poverty, which actually relate to something quite different. I'm thinking of measures to support the rollout of electric car charging infrastructure. This is described as a response to transport poverty unavailability. So I know, sorry, it's a rather broad question again, and perhaps not very clear, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think it's actually quite clear, and I thank you for the question. I think it's kind of it's an important question because if you think, now I think we've been moving away from strictly income-based definition. So if you look about the European indicators over the last 10 years, I've been including more things about access to a certain set of things, about whether or not you can pay for certain bills. I mean, there's all these indicators are more precise about what does it say exactly about your living conditions, right? Because of course, if let's say you take the World Bank definition, $1 a day definition that was kind of shaped in the late 70s and then become a big thing in the 80s, that gives you this graph of huge progress through the world. Because of course, if you think about people living under this idea of absolute poverty, of course, it seems to be declining. But again, yeah, if you live in a country and you have $2 a day, but where education is free and healthcare is free, it's very different than if you live in a country where you have $2 a day, but you have to pay for those things. So the problem with those income definitions, of course, they don't give you a very precise picture about the actual living conditions of people there. And that's obviously immediately the reason why Amartya Sen developed his idea of capability. So what exactly people can just changing this. But actually, what exactly do they have access to? What can they do? And they the UN developed this. I actually have it here. I mean, I'm not saying anything new here, right? But there's the indicators of human development. What is, of course, underlying there that would, of course, liberal economists, I mean, neoliberal economists wouldn't like. It is normative. It actually imposes a certain set of needs that we consider as more important than others. And that's, of course, a political question. The advantage with the income-based version is that it doesn't actually requires for you to actually say that that's what you should do. It doesn't impose a certain model of development. I think it's wrong because it misses the point of being in a society. You need to have access to a certain set of things. There is a certain expectations. You can't function properly in a society if you don't have access to education. But again, the question is the normative aspect that is there, that is sometimes seen as problematic. But I think it's a way more efficient way to actually reach a certain set of concrete goals that will, seriously transform people's lives. We've seen that with the COVID cash. There's been a few studies about where the money of all these cash transfers went. First by Trump and then by Biden, they make this huge set of transfers to American citizens. And most of those transfers were used to pay bills, to pay, healthcare bills, to pay your landlord. And so if you look, of course, about what progress did you make in these kinds of indicators, well, not many. Not much. So yeah, I think I would definitely be more interested in using more these concrete indicators.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mariama, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
That's amazing. I think you touched a little bit on the question already, but I wanted to maybe hear a bit more about the current trends of deregulation of the labor market and the role that poverty plays in wealth creation in capitalist societies, and what the poor and how the poor play a role in making companies and some people richer than they already are.
Thanks for your question. Another big question. One interesting. Again, I'm not an expert on these questions. I've been very interested in conceptualization, so it's kind of a more intellectual history. So I'm not always very precise on how exactly today this evolution of what we call the working poor, because this is what is at stake, right? It's like if the question of the social question in the 19th century was the status of labor, the whole institutions in the 20th century were built to actually guarantee that if you work, you're not poor in a way, right? The idea being poor meant depending on your labor. So the association between work and poverty was crucial in the 19th century. And then you arrive in the 20th century, you have labor laws, you have social security. Basically, being poor is not having a job. And all these evolutions, the transformations of the labor market that we've seen, certainly now in Belgium for sure, have been completely transforming that. I mean, Germany over the last 20 years, meaning that more and more people actually work, but are also poor. They don't make it to the poverty line. So that's a big shift for sure. It's like now having a job doesn't guarantee you to be out of poverty. So it's kind of I'm not going to say way back to the 19th century, but certainly a way that shows how this whole architecture is completely transformed and certainly, I mean, not completely destroyed. That would be excessive, but certainly less effective to protect individuals from poverty, even when they work. And that's, I think, it's certainly a kind of a very concerning evolution in European context.
I have a follow-up question to your general presentation, because you mentioned this tension between market regulation, post-market regulation, or pre-market social security. And my follow-up question would be on who should pay for it? Because if it's on post-market regulation, that it's to conjure the negative effect of the market. And here you have a literature on fiscal justice of who should it be a collective effort or the effort of a few who benefits from the market? Where are we on this? And if it's pre-market regulation or pre-market anti-poverty measures, then again, who should pay for it? Should it be the state, but through which means? And should it be the state? Could it be other institutions such as workers' institution, as it was originally the case with the Social Security?
Well, that's another another big question.
We should have EAPN Talk for each question, but you have 5 minutes for this one.
No, I think it's that's definitely a good topic for a whole discussion. I mean, again, I wouldn't make a huge difference between whether it's pre or post, and that would be associated with different kind. I mean, I do think, yeah, there is certainly a lot of things to do in terms of fiscal justice. The question, I guess, that I would now I actually forgot what I wanted to say. Yeah, I don't know. So, but what I would say is like you do. No, I actually I wanted to say something very precise, and I lost myself in that joke. So I will come back later.
Okay, I will leave the floor to Georgios then, and maybe hopefully we will come back to this.
Hello, thank you for your very nice presentation. I'm also working for the Committee of the Regions, as Lucy who spoke earlier. We very recently adopted an opinion on the anti-poverty strategy, which I strongly encourage you to have a look at. And we had met with the anti-poverty network during the deliberations to do it. My question is a follow-up question on the in-work poverty, in the sense that in the US, for example, since the 1950s, you had each worker's productivity increasing ninefold, but real wages have remained stagnant. And also following also the figure that you saw where the public spending towards social security has been increased, a big portion of it is toward food stamps, because 41.7 million Americans have to live on food stamps, many of them already working. So should there be some stricter regulation that sort of connects, links real wages with productivity? That would be my first question. And I have another question, if you don't mind. How do you cope with market disruptions? You mentioned that the market also many times defines how poverty measures will be dealt with. Just to take example from Yanis Varoufakis' book about technofederalism, now we have a rather distorted system of market where you have companies actually producing nothing, but still having everybody has to pay a levy on them in order to use their algorithms and show their work. Is there a way around market disruptions in a sense that we can help people manage not to be affected by those?
So thanks for the question. I now remember what I want to say also, so I'll do something about this. But I mean, on real wages and productivity, I mean, I guess that's specifically the case with the US, certainly, I mean, lately a bit less, but certainly the case in the US. I mean, I wouldn't be, I don't think that, I mean, there is like a formal solution to it. Like, I mean, in Belgium, we do have that. We have, maybe that's a good model for other countries, which is the fact that wages are automatically indexed to inflation. And interestingly, the Commission, and that's something that actually links to something that I wanted to say before, and this is very specific, peculiar to the Belgian model, which is even the Commission that decides what is in the basket that will define the level of inflation, that would measure inflation, is a commission that is composed not of technocrats, not just of economists. It's also with the representative of unions, of different social bodies that shape the Belgian model. So it's a political question, and so in response to your question, I would say I don't think it's something you can just solve by some kind of a magic legislation. There is something about how we can recreate a favorable balance of power in the workplace, how we democratize the workplace. So there's a lot of discussions about different models of how do we govern corporations, what are the place that workers have in decision-making in corporations. Of course, there are, I mean, the German model is one. I mean, but I think we have to revive all those discussions, which is the question of democracy at work, how we share the wealth of the company, how we decide about how work takes place in the company, or what we do. And all those questions have more or less disappeared. I mean, now they're coming back, but for the last 30 years, I think the workplace has been depoliticized, and that I think is kind of dramatic, because I do a big part of our life happens in the workplace, and that's where also decisions over our life are taken, and most of the time without the participation of those who are immediately concerned. So it has to be tied, I would say, with a broader reflection about democracy in the economic sphere and models of decision making within corporations. So that's the one thing I would say about this. And then there are definitely ways to actually tie wages to maybe productivity. That's something that maybe we should think about, but certainly to inflation. And I would definitely advocate for the version we have in Belgium, although it has been contested very strongly. On the question of taxes, I mean, something you suggested was something else than the state. And that I think is kind of an interesting discussion, which is at the beginning, especially in France, the idea of the founder of Social Security was that it would be managed by workers themselves. So you have all these, of course, resources that are immediately socialized, and it wouldn't be immediately controlled by the state. And I think that's kind of an important and interesting idea that has been quite rapidly put aside. And you have this kind of the state rapidly to control, I would say, made it a more kind of a technocratic discussions about how to finance it, how to make it sustainable. But it definitely put aside any kind of form of participation in those institutions. And I think that might be an interesting way to also, again, enhance the question of participation. And I think it's kind of a central question today, which is definitely that the way democracy works today doesn't seem to be very functioning. And it lacks spaces where we can politicize all those questions, especially politicize the question of needs. And so, maybe allowing these non-state or these institutions to be less technocratic would be an interesting perspective.
Thank you very much. If there is no other question, I have myself another set of questions that I would assume is also a very broad question. Is one type of labor that has been kept out of the market for centuries is domestic labor. not in the labor market, it's in other type of market, marital market, or but the domestic labor is unpaid, and it has been kept out of the market for centuries, if not more. How do you relate the domestic labor with the impact it has on poverty, or the discussion it has on poverty and the reproduction of labor of poverty? Is there any literature on it?
So there is a huge literature on it. Yeah. Again, I'm not a specialist on that literature. I mean, if we look at the big story here, it would be a story about the relationship between what we call what feminists actually call the reproductive sphere and the productive sphere, right? So we produce a lot of things, but in order to produce all those things, you need to reproduce the worker himself, right? He needs to be back the day after at the door of the factory, and for that you need someone that will, clean clothes, that make the meals, that take care of the kids. And it's pretty clear that the solution by the second half of the 19th century was to actually push women out of the labor market. So at the beginning of the Industrial Revolutions, women were definitely very populated all those big units of productions. They were working, but it really created this kind of crisis of reproduction. I mean, all those kids that were working in factories, women were working, and the solution that was, not thought by one person, but the idea was that we need the family as a structure to guarantee the reproduction of the labor force. So obviously there was another option. The other option is socializing all these tasks, right? But that was not obviously the option that was taken. And yeah, by the 60s and 70s, of course, especially the 70s, the feminist movement will obviously completely question this model of the male wage earner, and women will. And this is probably one of the biggest transformation of the labor market over the 20th century, which is like women massively going back on the labor market. But it will done in a very unequal way, meaning upper middle class women will be able to actually pay for those tasks to be done by, poor women either coming from southern countries or that actually will do what we call the double shift. So they come to your place, clean things, take care of the kids, while upper middle class women can have a career. And so it has been done, but at a serious cost. And I think in a certain way, one of I actually have a graph on this somewhere, or I don't have it. No, I don't have it here. One of the element that's crucially lacking here is obviously how we provide a way to guarantee to everyone access to those socializing of reproductive labor. One aspect is, of course, free childcare, and this, it's not surprised that the new mayor of New York. New York is not the United States; it's a very specific kind of place of its own. It was an election between two Democrats, but one of the key demands of Zoran Mamdani was free childcare, and this is something that actually has been quite important in most of the debates today about gender equality, about the opportunities on the labor market for women. And for anyone that actually has a kid, you all know that having access to childcare is like extremely difficult, and if you have to go through the private market, it's extremely expensive. So that would be, there's a huge literature on it, but for sure that there is a space there for definitely for increasing a certain set of rights and guaranteeing the access to these kind of services.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can take a last question. Juliana, do you have a question? I think you have a question.
Thank you, Kahina, for putting me on the spot. Hi, Danielle. Nice to meet you. I'm Juliana, EAPN's director. We have been discussing internally for a while now on universal basic income, and we know this is part of your work, this is part of your literature. And straight to the point without navigating, I'd like to hear your position on OBI as more and more political groups, political parties from the whole political spectrum exploring UBI as a new solution for when it comes to income, support income. So I'd like to just get your clear vision. I know that you have written a book about that, just on that, but I'd like to hear your opinion about UBI, especially in the context of the current political, let's say, ecosystem.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a big, that's an interesting, fascinating topic, because I mean, part of the interest in the subject is like the moment you open the door of basic income, you open a lot of doors. You open the doors about the question of work, you open the question about, of course, poverty, you open the question about gender inequality. So it was a demand from some feminist thinkers in the 70s, this idea of wages for housework, which is not exactly basic income, but it's like it definitely taps into all these questions. So generally, it is a kind of a useful topic to discuss a lot of those social questions we are facing now. So I would say my opposition is it's not like a radical opposition, but I mean I'm a sort of skeptic of basic income as a solution. I mean there are I would say one kind of argument would be basically the affordability. I think it's the most boring version. But in a way, if you look about our complex social systems, it's pretty obvious that they are not complex because it's, there's just messy and there's a lot of bureaucrats. It's because there are very different kind of needs in society. Some people need more money than others, depending on the conditions they have. And the idea of replacing it, because of course, if you add to all the existing, let's say you add 500 euros, the amount is already extremely important. And the danger is like you create a system where you give money to people that don't need it, and you don't give enough to people that actually need it. Right? But then again, it becomes kind of a huge discussion about kind of a more technocratic discussion about whether or not we can pay for it and whether or not the outcome is actually efficient. I mean, it does have a certain effect on child poverty for sure, but on many others, there's many simulations. It's actually impossible to eradicate poverty with the basic income, unless you actually make a very expensive basic income that obviously no one can pay for. So the simplicity of the idea makes it appealing, but the simplicity is precisely what actually makes it less efficient in many ways, because it doesn't really reflect the complexity of the needs that people are facing. The other question is I would say, I mean, I'm not against people getting cash, right? But it seems to me that over the last 30, 40 years, we've been shifting towards that version where less and less things are thought collectively and more are thought about guaranteeing your spending power on the market and about how we think about needs. And I always take this example, which is, if I remember, it was in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, and the budget of the city, I mean, at that time it wasn't fully integrated into China yet. There was more money than the government had to spend, which is obviously not the case for Brussels, for sure. And so there was a debate. The government said, what do we do with this excess of the budget? And so there were two options. One option is we send everyone a check, and the other option is we make a big debate or a referendum, or we actually deliberate collectively about what could we do with that money. And the decision, of course, was let's send everybody a check. Everybody want to have a check and buy some stuff for themselves. But it kind of tells something about the evolution of our conception of democracy, where the idea of discussing together about things seems completely out of reach, and we favor more this idea of guaranteeing ourselves a certain level of life and kind of retreat into private life rather than expanding the public sphere and participation. So it's also about this kind of shifts in how we think about needs. And so I would generally, be more open or more interested about expanding a certain set of services like childcare, rather than be focused only on this income aspect. Aside aside, let's say, the fact that I'm already skeptic about whether or not it could effectively work as an anti-poverty tool. I also have, let's say, normative arguments that makes me reluctant to focus on this specific tool.
Thank you, Juliana, and thank you, Daniel, for your answer. Do we have one last question from the audience? Just to make sure. I don't see any hand raised. And I don't see anything in the chat. So thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us today. It was really, really interesting, at least for me, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of the rest of the audience to say that your vision were very not only interesting, but also food for thoughts for our work on anti-poverty, but also in what we aim to achieve as a network, as a members, and as social workers here in Brussels. So thank you very much. We hope to come across your work more in the future. And you're very much welcome in any of our next EAPN talk to participate, and we will for sure reach out for collaboration in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure, and I'm happy if it's useful, although of course an abstract picture. But yeah, I hope it would give some insights and ideas.
Definitely useful for sure, and I think we will continue discussing this EAPN talk, this seminar, this webinar, and this and your presentation for the month, if not the years to come. So thank you very much. Thank you, Susanna, and thank you the comms team for organizing the logistics, and thank you to my colleagues who helped me prepare this EAPN talk, and thank you everyone for attending and participating in the conversation. We will reach out for the next EAPN talk by the end of the year on mobilization and solidarity. You will hear about us very soon, and we're very happy to see you very, very soon as well. Thank you, and have a nice end of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.